Welcome to Film at 50, a podcast that celebrates semi-centennials in the world of cinema. I'm your host, Brian Rowe, and I'm very excited to have Jonathan Moore join me tonight for a very special Halloween episode of the podcast. We'll be talking about House of Dark Shadows, which came out on October 28th, 1970. How are we doing, Jonathan?
Well, we're doing fantastic, I guess I should say. It is the theme of the evening, after all. So how about you?
Doing well. For our listeners out there, you might not be able to see, but Jonathan, big horror fan like myself, he's got all sorts of props in the background, in the foreground, all sorts of cool stuff in his room.
Yes, it is the shrine to all things from the horror film history. We got our Halloween tree mask, the big ones up there. Halloween tree mask. We got a Lugosi mask, a Chaney mask. There's Karloff behind me. We've got everybody. And then we've got some Dark Shadows people over here, and Michael Myers. I don't know if you can see Michael Myers there.
Yeah. For our listeners, yeah, I'm also wearing my Michael Myers t-shirt. This is from the 2003 25th anniversary Halloween convention in Pasadena, California.
Oh,
it still fits.
That's cool.
It's not like super tight. That makes me happy.
Oh, that's good.
Yeah. I started film school in Los Angeles in August of 2003. And then 2 months later, there was the 25th anniversary Halloween convention. Had a bunch of people from the series and crew members and cast.
Cool.
It was 3 days and it was amazing. It was a really cool experience for a huge horror buff who had just moved to Los Angeles.
Yeah.
So we've been friends for a long time. We both love horror. We both love Halloween. If you just want to just kind of get us started, talk about kind of your love of movies in general and your love of horror films, kind of what got you into horror movies would be great.
So I believe that my first love was Dracula. And when I was young, they had a bunch of Universal Studio Monsters stuff out there. They had all kinds of products and stuff in the stores, and I just loved it. And I would constantly be buying the Universal Studio Monsters toys and the Halloween decorations and things along those lines. But my favorite was Dracula. There was something about Dracula that I really liked. I don't know if it was the way that he looked, if it was just the cape. It might have been the cape. But I became obsessed with Dracula probably about the age of 3. And then my mother introduced me to Dark Shadows, the television show. In fact, it was the primetime miniseries that ran on NBC from 1991, because she recorded it back in 91. And then I got a hold of those tapes. And I started putting the tapes in the VCR and just watching them, because I was endlessly fascinated by this vampire and all of these goings on at Collinwood. And I just really was very engaged in it. And there was stuff probably in the 1991 series that is like a 3 or 4 year old I should not be watching. I should not be exposed to. But it's okay, because she was watching Chucky one night on some cable channel or something. And I'm sitting there watching the whole thing, absolutely mortified and horrified by this doll that's going around like stabbing people. So it probably explains a lot, as Hitchcock would say. It all goes back to your childhood, and it probably explains a lot about me. And from being exposed to the 1991 Dark Shadows, then I watched reruns of the original Dark Shadows, and I don't think that there's ever been a year when I haven't watched Dark Shadows. Like that series is 1,200 episodes. 1,225 episodes. Mm-hmm. So it takes you a couple years to get through it. And then by the time you are at the end of it, you will have forgotten a lot of the stuff that happened. And so you just watch it over and over again. So I'm constantly doing that. You
have watched the entirety of Dark Shadows, all 1,200 plus episodes.
Oh, probably at least a dozen times.
Are you serious? Oh my God, I saw that number. I was like, what? That's a lot of show.
it's my favorite television show. And then Columbo's up there too, but Dark Shadows is my favorite. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So I got into horror at a young age too. I don't think it was like 3 or 4 years old like you, but my dad was super into horror movies, and like 8, 9, 10 years old, he was starting to show me a lot of the 80s horror films. Like he showed me Nightmare on Elm Street, and he showed me The Evil Dead. I was like 9 years old, and it was so gruesome and intense that at one point during the movie, I had to go to the bathroom, throw up, and then I came back and finished the movie.
You know, that actually, I never threw up in a film, but actually, the first time that I watched House of Dark Shadows, I had to turn it off because it was like late at night. I was watching it with my mom, and we rented it from Blockbuster or whatever because we just didn't know where to find, you know, these movies.
For
But
our
we could
younger
all,
listeners, Blockbuster was this place where you would go and you would like pick out a movie to watch and you'd bring it home. You had to bring it back.
the Frankenstein actually over for the people that are watching online on the video, you can actually see the Frankenstein. He's a Blockbuster item that I have back there.
Oh,
He
awesome.
is a
Yeah. No,
display
yeah, in the
of
upper right
Blockbuster.
corner,
Yeah.
I see Frankenstein's monster. It looks really cool.
Yes. So we've got Blockbuster displays. I've got all kinds of Blockbuster stuff all over the place. And I have a collection. I don't know if you know this about me, Brian. I have a collection of horror VHS.
Oh,
Yes.
I have
And
no more VHS tapes. They're gone. What do you have?
see, I collect everything that has cool art on the cover.
Mm,
Because that's the thing. They never make good artwork anymore
no.
for movies.
Mm-hmm.
And every time I went into Blockbuster, they always had these fantastic, like I just went to the horror section every single time and I just looked at all of the art because it was just endlessly fascinating because it was so good. And so I've collected VHS tapes from horror films. And I still remember being in Shopko and just staring at the Universal Monster ones because they were just so good. And so now I have most of them. I'm missing Bride of Frankenstein. I haven't been able to track that one down.
Okay.
But I have most of the other ones, and the artwork is just stellar. Universal really doesn't know what they're doing because they have never used that artwork again on any release, even though it's the best artwork to advertise. And I remember just being in Shopko for 30 minutes. My mother's like going in the kitchen section or something, and I just stared at the Universal Monsters display. That VHS artwork was just the best. And so I have a whole bunch of horror VHS tapes, and I still use a VCR, believe it or not.
Okay.
So there's a lot of things that I do, and it all goes back to the childhood and love of horror, and it's been with me all my life. There's never been a time period when I've been away from it. I have always constantly been involved in horror films and loving horror films, and they're just part of me. And I love discovering new ones and finding ones that I've not seen. So it's really cool.
Yeah, that's actually a big part of this podcast is that, you know, I tell people often that my favorite genre of films is horror films. And I tell people often that my favorite decade of horror films is 70s horror. And yet there are still a lot of 70s horror films I have not seen. So this podcast, this project of going back 50 years, starting in 2020, so going back to 1970, and then in the years to come, I'll probably, you know, hopefully discover some really cool horror films I might not have ever seen otherwise. I've already looked at a couple titles for 1971 that I've never heard of. So yeah, I'm excited to, you know, find some gems, find some discoveries in the years to come.
I cannot wait to do the Salem's Lot podcast.
Oh my gosh.
The Toby Hooper one. I really want to do that.
Okay. So in 9 years, you'll come back for that?
Yes. Yes, I will.
That was
and for
1979.
Halloween too. For Halloween too. So if you got a big panel for Halloween, you want to have a big group of people. I want to be there for Halloween. Yeah, there's a lot of ones that I do want to be here for. So
oh my gosh,
I'm excited.
I don't even, you know, my favorite horror film is the original Halloween from 1978. That'll be, I don't even know how I approach that episode. Like, you know, I don't want it to be 2 hours of me just gushing about every second. You know, like,
well,
okay,
are you doing Star Wars too?
Yeah, no, I've already talked in this podcast about, you know, The Godfather and Jaws and Star Wars. I mean, those films are going to be tough. Like, how do I know. Here's the plot summary of Star Wars will be tough, which I've joked about before. But yeah, I mean, this is not a podcast of just finding like, you know, forgotten, lost gems, obscure films. Like we are going to talk about, you know, major classic films too. So we're going to have to deal with those as they come. But for now, 1970, not a whole lot of films in 1970 that are like, you know, considered really like gems today. I mean, maybe 5 or 6, but there are a lot of films that I've already talked about on the podcast that I had just newly discovered. I didn't really know what they were all about. Yeah, so let's get into House of Dark Shadows, our film discussion today. So I'm just going to give you know this movie a lot more than I do, so you might have more to add to my plot summary, but I'm going to do a little plot summary. And then I'll go into some background info. And then you can give me a little bit more about kind of the history of this film and, you know, kind of what it means to you. So House of Dark Shadows, it tells of a hundreds-year-old vampire named Barnabas Collins. He's unleashed from his crypt by a drunk kind of character, right? Named
Willie Loomis.
Willie Loomis. Ooh,
Yeah,
Loomis.
yes, Loomis, like Dr. Loomis. Yes,
Sam Loomis
but
from
Willie
Sam.
Loomis was first. So
Okay, yeah. Well, no, Sam Loomis was in Psycho, so that was in
oh, that's
1960.
true. That's true. So there's a whole series of
Loomis.
Loomises. Yes, that's
Yeah.
true.
In all my novels, I have not named a character Loomis yet. I should do it one of these days. So Barnabas immediately goes on a killing spree, while at the same time tracking down his present-day family members, who are obviously surprised to see him. Their cousin, right? They think he's their cousin from England. Is that right?
Yes, that's how he introduces himself.
Yeah. So while coming to terms with this new life in this new century, he meets a woman named Maggie who reminds him of his dead fiance, and he wants her to be with him, become his new bride for all eternity. Meanwhile, there is a blood specialist named Julia who learns the truth about Barnabas and offers him a cure of his being a vampire, although that process is not as simple as she originally thinks, and it goes in directions that we don't expect. That's kind of like the general summary of the film of what's happening. Anything vital that I left out there?
No, I think that there's a lot of influence that Dark Shadows itself had on the world, and it also took some influence from some other things. You know, generally when people think about curing the vampire, uh, Dark Shadows is the one that comes to their mind
Okay.
because generally it hadn't been done before. But earlier in the House films, House of Frankenstein, House of Dracula, John Carradine, who played Dracula in those movies, he actually was seeking a cure, but not because he was a reluctant vampire, not because he was remorseful about having become a vampire, but sort of as a means to get into this particular household and attack this lady and stuff like that. But that kind of and the whole Lon Chaney as the Wolfman, finding the cure for lycanthropy.
Mm-hmm.
That is sort of the basis for this finding a cure in Dark Shadows. But a lot of people will just say that Dark Shadows is, we have the reluctant vampire in Dark Shadows. And it's true, Dark Shadows does have the reluctant vampire. And Dark Shadows did change vampires from that point, 1967 forward.
Mm-hmm.
And they've never been the same since.
Okay.
So in that way, yes. But also Dark Shadows influenced heavily a lot of things going forward. You've got the whole Anne Rice, the
Mm-hmm.
series of novels, Interview with the Vampire, inspired directly by Dark Shadows, the television series. The Stephen King was heavily influenced by Dark Shadows,
Mm-hmm.
and The Shining, I think, has a major connection to Dark Shadows, the television series.
Oh, cool.
And then of course Salem's Lot as well. But when you think about, one of the more prominent, more recent Dracula movies from 1992, Francis Ford Coppola's Dracula,
Mm-hmm.
Bram Stoker's Dracula, that whole thing is based on Dark Shadows.
Okay. Yeah.
Because there's no connection to reincarnation anywhere in Bram Stoker's novel
Mm-hmm.
or in any previous Dracula adaptation. And so that whole thing is lifted from Dark Shadows and probably House of Dark Shadows. That whole concept is, and I don't know if anybody's pointed that out before, but I'm calling baloney on Coppola here for saying that he kind of invented that, if he ever claims to have invented that, because it's clearly a Dark Shadows trope. That is very much a Dark Shadows invention. The reluctant vampire and the whole reincarnation aspect all goes back to Dark Shadows.
Okay, interesting. Do you think there was any influence on Dark Shadows of anything that came before? Like when I was watching House of Dark Shadows today, I was reminded of a lot of like the Hammer horror films of the late 50s
Yes.
and 60s. Was some of that kind of...
So Dan Curtis, the director, bless his soul, really wanted to make this film bloody.
Mm-hmm.
He wanted to make this like over the top, everything that he could, that ABC would not let him do on television. He wanted to, show the brutality. He wanted to show the gore. And so many kids, because Dark Shadows was a phenomenon. Like it was like the K-pop of its time. You know, it's this huge thing that everybody is just all into and everybody wants to be a part of and everybody's watching. I mean, you literally have kids running home from school to watch Barnabas, to watch the Collins family on Dark Shadows. For this extended period of time, 1968, like huge ratings boom, 1969, huge ratings, like just this massive success, and all of these people watching Dark Shadows. And there were limitations, obviously budgetary limitations, that ABC, because it was a daily show, had for Dark Shadows. But there were also censorship things and things that they couldn't necessarily do, though they got away with a lot of stuff. They got away with a lot of stuff. Like it's kind of interesting the amount of stuff that they got away with on a daily basis on daytime television, but they were able to do it.
That is that is absolutely crazy for me to think that this was like on daytime, like a soap opera, like a One Life to Live, Days of Our Lives.
Yeah,
like
no,
I can't even
it wasn't
imagine
anything like that. But
I can't even imagine today if there was like a a horror soap opera that ran 5 days a week. I can't even imagine.
I know, because nowadays, you're lucky if you get 6 episodes in a season. Imagine, having to write for 23 episodes a month. I mean, it's just absolutely insane. And some of the writing of the original Dark Shadows is absolutely spectacular. Some of the early episodes, Malcolm Marmerstein, I hope I said his name correctly, just a phenomenal writer. Just some of the best monologues and dialogue that you've heard in any television show or movie. There's a lot of it, and I think it's significantly underappreciated, because these writers, and both of us being writers, I don't know how he did it. Like, he just came up with this stuff, and he had to turn out scripts like overnight. And then of course there was this other writer, Violet Wells was her name.
Okay.
Really phenomenal writer on the original Dark Shadows. Just fantastic one-liners. Like, the people behind The Office, the people behind all, they would just love Violet Wells' quips and her characterizations of some of these characters. They're just really phenomenal. And I think that soap operas often have like a bad name because they're like, oh, the bad writing and all this other stuff. But Dark Shadows didn't fall victim to that. It's a very well written, well scripted program, especially in terms of some of that dialogue. I mean, it's just phenomenal stuff. And it's a really unique thing because it was done live.
Okay.
They did not edit those episodes.
Wow.
So they recorded them live on tape, and if you messed up, you messed up, and it was broadcast to the entire nation. If you flubbed your line, or if a boom mic got in the shot or something like that. And I mean, absolute credit, because you and I both do film work. We're both involved in the process of making things, and we know how much time it takes just to get something right, and how much time it takes to memorize lines. And these folks are just so like professional to be able to do that in this little cramped studio in New York City. Probably hot as all get out in the summer months, and just putting up with these conditions. So great work to them. But the making of this movie, House of Dark Shadows, was probably just as hectic, even though they had a larger budget and stuff like that. But going back to your original question about Dan Curtis and the gore and the Hammer influence, yeah, Dan Curtis really liked to push boundaries, and he really wanted to push the boundaries with this. He wanted to show Barnabas Collins as this really brutal killer. He wanted to, sort of bring this guy to life. And so he reflected a lot on Hammer's legacy, especially with the Dracula films, when he was looking for the visual influence for House of Dark Shadows, which came as quite a shock to a lot of parents that went with their kids to go see the movie, because their kids watch this every day, and all of a sudden now they're going to go on a weekend to watch this movie, and now they're not letting their kids watch the show anymore because it was so violent.
Yeah, it's very violent.
It was just it's an extremely violent picture. So that's actually one of the things. But yeah, there's a huge Hammer influence in this film.
Yeah, so let's talk about background info on the movie. As you mentioned, it's based on this show, and it would make sense to me, especially if you're making like 5 episodes a week or something, where it's airing on ABC, so you can't really do a whole lot with like makeup effects and gore and things. It would make sense to me that Curtis would want to make a feature film that where he could actually have like effects and gore
Yeah.
and go a little bit more extreme than he could on the show. So it sounds like, a few years into the show, he approached the producers like, what do you think about making it into a film? If they're making thousands of episodes, I feel like could be, or I mean, a lot of episodes. Sounds like it'd be hard to pinpoint, like, what's the storyline of the film? Like there's been so many stories for years. Because as you said, okay, 1,200 plus episodes, that's a lot of stories. So it's like, okay, what do we tell our 90-minute feature film with? And so, it did not feel to me like, oh, this was probably, made 4 years into a television show. It wasn't like the X-Files film that came out in 98, where you kind of had to know a lot of the show before you saw the movie. When you watch the movie, you'd be kind of lost if you hadn't seen the series. Whereas this kind of felt like the beginning of a story. It didn't feel like, oh, I should go back and watch the first 700 episodes of Dark Shadows.
Yeah.
So I feel like that was a smart decision on their part, right?
I think so. They had actually there was an interview during the promotion of the show, and Joan Bennett sat down with, I don't remember who the interviewer was, but the interviewer's like, well, you've got so many episodes and you've done so many things. Like, how did we decide what to do? And she's like, oh, we're going back to the original. We're going back to the first story. But she had forgotten that there was an entire year before Barnabas came. So the original story, as it were, didn't have a vampire in it. There was a lot of supernatural influence, but ghosts didn't show up in the show until Dan Curtis's daughter said the ratings were falling, and Dan Curtis's daughter said, hey, why don't you add a ghost, Daddy? And he's like, okay, fine, we'll add a ghost. And then from that point forward, then they had the best storyline in the show is a Phoenix storyline. And it happens before Barnabas arrives. It's the story immediately before the arrival of Barnabas Collins. And it is so well executed and so well done. It's just a phenomenal storyline. And that's kind of where the ratings started picking up. Okay. And so they laid the groundwork for the arrival of Barnabas Collins. And then all of a sudden, Barnabas arrives and he becomes this teen heartthrob. And everybody just wants Barnabas to bite them. And it just picks up from there. And it becomes, it goes down in history as, just this phenomenon.
Teen heartthrob? What are you talking about?
Oh, yes. Barnabas was like the Beatles. He was like the Beatles. And then they introduced Quentin Collins, David Selby as Quentin Collins, and he started off as a ghost, and then he became a zombie when they went back in time after they killed him, and they brought him back to life, and then he became a werewolf after that, and then he became sort of like Dorian Gray after that. So Quentin is very complicated, but he was the other major heartthrob on the show. So Barnabas was the first, and then Quentin was the second.
Okay.
And so actually, it's sort of interesting because Jonathan Frid, who plays Barnabas Collins, said, "I can't handle this. I can't handle this fame. You need to do something about it. I need another leading male in this show to sort of take some of this off of me." And so that's when they brought David Selby on to play Quentin Collins. And Dark Shadows launched a lot of careers. David Selby, obviously he's still acting today.
Okay.
John Carlin in Cagney and Lacey, he won some awards for that. Kate Jackson, Charlie's Angels, she was in Dark Shadows. Okay. So yeah,
the film, I did not recognize a single actor. Like there wasn't anybody where I thought, oh, I know that person.
Grayson Hall was nominated for an Oscar. So she played Dr. Julia Hoffman. She was nominated for an Oscar in the late 60s for Night of the Iguana.
Oh, cool.
And then Joan Bennett, of course, very famous film actress from the 1930s and 40s. Scarlet Street is one of her. She was the Bennetts of the acting family, this really big acting family. But there was, and she would have continued in movies, but for the fact that there was a scandal involving her husband. And so then that kind of put an end to her career. Nowadays, people in Hollywood have all kinds of scandals, and they just continue acting in movies. But back then it was just sort of became something, and you're just like, well, I don't know. So
sometimes a scandal rocks an actor where we don't see them anymore.
this is like Care Bear stuff though. This thing was just like Care Bear stuff. So I mean, nowadays there's scandals like that are like scandals, but then there's just like everyday normal stuff that happens in Hollywood all the time, and nobody bats an eye at, and that's kind of what happened with her.
Okay.
So it's just sort of like, yeah, it's just weird how to think about the differences. But yeah, Joan Bennett, really famous, very talented film actress from the golden age of Hollywood.
Okay, cool.
And then she was also in Suspiria.
Oh, great horror film. Dario
Yes,
Argento, yeah.
yes.
Okay,
So she
cool.
was in Suspiria in the late 70s. So yeah,
Okay,
so
very
there
nice.
should be some folks you recognize. Yeah.
Okay, cool. So yeah, I just have a few other things. So the film was shot concurrently with the Dark Shadows series. Like the movie was being made while the show was being shot.
Yes.
So many characters appearing in the film were temporarily written out of the series so that the actors could be available to shoot the movie, which I found really interesting. Like I mentioned X-Files, right? Like they shot the X-Files movie like on the hiatus from the show. They weren't shooting both at the same time. So the idea that they're shooting the show at the same time that they're making the movie, and then they have to like pull actors from the show over to the film, that I mean, is that kind of unheard of? Like I'm like when does that ever happen? You know?
But the expectation for being on Dark Shadows was just this high already, and then they just made it this high, so it's totally off the charts.
Yeah.
For all of our podcast listeners, you'll know that I started my hand like at the top of my screen, and then I went beyond my screen.
Yeah.
Because it was just crazy. Because Dan Curtis was, frankly, kind of crazy in terms of his expectations. He's kind of like me. He has very high expectations for people and things, and he's like, no, we're just going to do it, and he just did it. So they decided that they were going to have David Selby and Laura Parker lead the television show cast in parallel time. So they went to an alternate universe for that particular part of the show, while Jonathan Frid, Catherine Lee Scott, Grayson Hall, Joan Bennett all went off to to film House of Dark Shadows.
Okay.
And so Barnabas Collins was locked in a coffin during the time on the show. He was chained in his coffin on the television series, which, as I mentioned, it was the inspiration for Anne Rice's Interview with the Vampire, because the character that John Carlin, Willie Loomis, played was an alternate reality version of himself. He locked Barnabas in a coffin and started to write a book about his life. He was interviewing him, Interview with the Vampire, and to write his own novel. Yeah. So that's sort of a cool connection there. But yeah, that's kind of how it went down. So they wrote those characters off the show for a while, which did have a negative impact on the ratings, because people weren't seeing Barnabas for like a month.
Yeah.
So that was kind of and that in conjunction with another storyline that they had right before the filming of House of Dark Shadows, which showed Barnabas being mean, like he was in House of Dark Shadows, was not something that audiences liked. They liked a nice Barnabas, because Barnabas, started off as being this crazy dude. He comes out of a coffin, he kidnaps this girl, he tries to brainwash her, tries to turn her into the reincarnation of his lost love. And so he was like, absolutely crazy. I mean, you'd be crazy too if you were locked in a coffin for 200 years. But then he comes out and, he's just crazy and vicious, and he's constantly trying to kill Julia Hoffman, Grayson Hall. He's like, we must do away with Dr. Hoffman. He's constantly doing that. And so, but by the time you got to 1969, everybody forgot about that. And they're just so used to Barnabas constantly saving people and being the hero, that they just were not prepared to see an evil Barnabas. So those two things kind of led to a decline in ratings and the ultimate cancellation of the series in 1971. But yeah, it was absolutely crazy how they managed to do two things at once. Like, nobody would do that today.
Oh, I mean, I'm sure there are people who could do. I mean, Richard Linklater made a film over 12 years. That was kind of crazy, but he did it and he made a great film. So I mean, there are some experimental directors who might try to do something like that, but yeah, you're not going to see that. It's pretty rare.
But I mean, you're running a show for one of the big three networks.
Yep.
And you're producing a movie for one of the major studios. I mean, and both were just on board with it. They were both okay with it. It's fascinating. I want to know how the negotiations and the contracts went with that. But incidentally, House of Dark Shadows did save MGM from bankruptcy that year.
Really? Okay. Yes. I couldn't find how much money it made. So it did really well.
Yes, it did very well, and they wanted a sequel. And Jonathan Frid said no, because it was too bloody. He did not like all of the violence and gore. Similar to Peter Cushing who really didn't like The Exorcist, Jonathan Frid was just like, you know what? This is not the kind of thing that I want to do again. I do not want to be in a film that is so, because we would have had a sequel to this one, a direct sequel, which would follow Barnabas, continuing,
Okay.
but for the fact that it was so absolutely bloody. So Dan Curtis kind of, put a stake in his own heart when it came to House of Dark Shadows and taking it to this extreme, which was so far removed from what people saw on television every day. But if you want to see an extended edition of House of Dark Shadows, watch the NBC miniseries. It was actually called Dark Shadows: The Motion Picture when it debuted in 1991. That's how it was billed, but it was always scheduled to go to series.
It's a new something new made in 1991, or it's the same movie from 70.
Well, it's kind of a remake of House of Dark Shadows.
It's new actors.
Yes, new actors: Joanna Going, Joseph Gordon-Levitt, Ben Cross, Gene Simmons.
Oh, cool.
So all of those folks. Yeah, and you get to see Joseph Gordon-Levitt as a little boy.
Very young.
David Collins.
Yeah.
Yes.
The first credit I know of his is Angels in the Outfield, and that was 1994.
Yeah.
So this was 91, you say? So he must be very young.
91, yeah. He did a great job. He was phenomenal. I mean, I think there were so many really, really phenomenal actors, and the budget was spectacular. And Bob Cobert came back to do the music. Robert Cobert came back to do the music in the 1991. And he took all of his original music and just brought it to with this full orchestra and just really beautiful. It's my favorite soundtrack, actually, the 1991 Dark Shadows.
Oh, cool.
It's my favorite score. Yeah.
Yeah, I didn't know that there was a 91 version. I'll have to check that out. So a few other things about Dan Curtis. So this was his first film as a director, was House of Dark Shadows. He had directed the show, but he hadn't made a film before. He originally thought...
I'm going to correct you there. He only directed a few episodes.
Not all of them, but obviously he wouldn't be able to.
but literally only a handful. He only had a little experience directing Dark Shadows. He was mostly a producer of the show, and he directed golf before. He directed golf specials for the networks before taking on Dark Shadows. But then he went on to, he won a lot of awards for The Winds of War and a lot of.
I saw he won an Emmy in the 80s.
Yes.
So he didn't only do horror for the rest of his career, but he did do some horror after this. So real quick, he originally thought about editing together footage from the series to make a feature-length movie, but that idea was quickly abandoned. Probably for the best.
That wouldn't work. Yes. Yes. So, absolutely.
His second film after this was the sequel, Night of Dark Shadows, which, as you mentioned, does not feature Barnabas. I looked up that actor, Jonathan Frid. I mean, he basically retired after this movie. He has 8 credits on IMDb. He didn't really act very much after this.
No.
So
he kind of became kind of like Lugosi.
Yeah.
He kind of became typecast by the role of Barnabas, because you couldn't have him go anywhere without people recognizing him as Barnabas. And ABC did such a great job on promoting Dark Shadows. I mean, he has pictures with Santa Claus and Bozo the Clown. He's got he just went all around the country, and people were constantly, it's sort of like saying, hey, Paul McCartney, let's put you in a new band, Wings, but you're always going to associate him with the Beatles. And the same thing happened to Jonathan Frid. So for better or worse. Yeah.
So as you said, Curtis went on to win some awards. He won an Emmy. He would also direct some more horror films. He directed a Dracula adaptation in 1974, and he directed a film that I've seen that I love. It's called Trilogy of Terror from 1975. Karen Black anthology film. I did not know he had directed that as well. So he had some, wasn't just Dark Shadows. He went on to do
Burnt Offerings. Burnt
Offerings, another horror film. I have not seen that one, but I've heard good things, so I'll definitely get to it at some point. Yeah.
Yes, it's kind of like The Shining in a lot of ways.
Oh, cool.
Burnt Offerings.
Yeah.
It's kind of
so that's
76. I would say.
76. So I'll definitely get to it. It might be a few years, but I'll get to it. All right, cool. So that's all the background info. Is there anything else we left out? I feel like we were pretty thorough. Anything else that we wanted to talk about?
Just about the background of the thing.
The making of.
It was. So here's the thing. Even though they had a budget, they didn't have that big of a budget.
Okay.
So rather than spend all of the money building sets, they actually just drove the actors because Colin would. So let me a little background here. Collinwood is an actual house in the television series. It's an actual house. It's Seaview Terrace or the Carey Mansion in Newport.
Okay.
And so that was where they did the exterior shots of Collinwood. And so that was very recognizable to television audiences. But Newport is too far away from New York City, where they shot the television show and where everybody lived. So they had to find a location that was closer because they didn't want to build sets and all of that other stuff on a soundstage. Then they wanted to, find a mansion they could actually use. So they used the Lyndhurst Mansion in Tarrytown, New York.
Okay.
And so they drove all of the actors every day from New York City. They got on their cars and they drove out to Lyndhurst, which is Sleepy Hollow, incidentally. So the cemetery scenes were shot in Sleepy Hollow Cemetery, where Washington Irving is buried. And they used the mausoleum that's there. You can go see it to this day. And they just put a big Collins over it. And so that became the Collins Mausoleum. So the mansion itself, Lyndhurst Mansion, has been used in a lot of movies and television specials and things like that throughout the years, including, I don't know if you have seen this one, but you might have, Brian. It's the Judd Hirsch, the night. I
love Judd Hirsch.
The Halloween that almost wasn't.
I haven't seen that, but it sounds great.
The night Dracula saved Halloween.
What year? Do you know the year?
It was from the 70s.
Okay.
And they played it, then they played it all the way up, on television on Disney Channel through, probably up to 2000 or something. It was always one of those big specials. And so, yeah. And so I never made the connection ever. Like, because that was like my favorite thing that I watched next to a Disney Halloween. Those were my two things that I watched. Like as a child, those were the ones I watched constantly.
Okay.
And I never recognized the Lyndhurst estate as being Dracula's castle and also being Collinwood Mansion until just a few years ago. So that was kind of cool.
It doesn't happen often. Sometimes like two movies will use the same set, right? Like I think the Psycho House was used on like in another film or like on a TV series. And that's just like wild to me. Like you can't, like an iconic set. Like how do you use that in something else? And just it's not the same house.
The Munsters house.
Yeah.
Has constantly been reused. It was in like what was that Housewives show from like the early 2000s?
Desperate Housewives, because it's on the Universal backlot, and so it's easy. Yeah. It's just there, so they can use it for things.
And they're constantly, remodeling that. But as an actual house, you can't do anything to the architecture of the house. It's a historically significant place, protected place, but it just appears in all of these things, and so that's kind of cool. But the actual Collinwood from the television show is different from the Lyndhurst estate. But I think that it worked very well.
Oh yeah.
For this film and created quite a spectacular setting. Which, just another bit of trivia. I know you're tired of hearing it, but the old house, Barnabas's house on the television show, burnt down in 1969.
Okay.
In the middle of them making the show. The exterior burnt down.
Oh geez.
There was a fire and it burnt down. Well, you can't just, replace that. So we never got any new images of the exterior of the old house on the television show. But they needed to, which is very unfortunate because it's located on the Lyndhurst estate. It was located on the Lyndhurst estate. So, but for the fact that it burnt down 1 year before, they could have shot everything on the Lyndhurst estate with Collinwood and the old house being there. But the old house burned down, so they had to find a new old house.
Wow.
For the movie. So, yeah, that's just kind of cool.
Right. That's awesome.
Dick Smith.
Yeah.
Well, the makeup.
Dick Smith was the makeup artist.
Yes.
Did a great job.
Yes. And so this was, of course, his precursor to the makeup in The Godfather.
Okay.
With the transformation of Barnabas Collins.
Yeah.
So that's a cool little tidbit too. And I'm sure there's going to be more things as we continue.
Yeah, and then we can talk about more as we go on here. But let's get to the film and what we like about it. What I believe this is like obviously since we started talking here, I can tell this is one of your favorite horror films, one of your favorite vampire movies.
Yes.
What do we like about the film House of Dark Shadow?
I mostly like the fact that I get to see the original television cast, all of these actors from the original series brought in and on the big screen, telling a very concise adaptation basically of Dracula, because it doesn't adapt Dark Shadows all that well. The only
Okay.
thing that it adapts from Dark Shadows is the reincarnation aspect of Barnabas finding his lost love, Josette,
Mm-hmm.
the cure of the vampire, and then the backfire of the cure of the vampire. Those are literally the three aspects from the original Barnabas story that House of Dark Shadows adapts.
Mm-hmm.
But the rest of it is, I think, it functions as the best film adaptation of Dracula
Okay.
because it follows the Dracula plot line. Dracula arrives in England and he moves into this house and
Mm-hmm.
across from the sanitarium, and he has his first victim, Lucy, and then he finds another victim, Mina, and then there's this whole thing to chase down Dracula, find Dracula, and save Mina, and that's it functions as probably the best film adaptation of Dracula that there is, but it doesn't have Dracula in it.
Yeah.
So if they wrote this as Dracula, it would probably be like one of the greatest Dracula adaptations, because if it takes the story of Dracula and just makes it so concise and so palatable for 90 minutes, whereas you can't take that novel and make it do everything you would with that novel. Like, I don't have an adaptation of Dracula that I think is perfect, but I think House of Dark Shadows is pretty darn close, but for the fact that there's no Dracula in it. So I think they were less successful in adapting Dark Shadows to the screen and more successful in adapting Dracula to the screen. So I think when Dan Curtis eventually made the Jack Palance version of Dracula a few years later, he would have been wise to have used this script, but that's only me.
There's ready for some controversy. So I came into this totally cold. I hadn't seen the show. I've seen vampire films over the years, but it's not like my favorite kind of movie.
Yeah.
I liked a lot of this film. I did not think House of Dark Shadows was a great horror film. I thought a lot of it was kind of slow. Some of the acting was pretty stiff. I loved a lot of the atmosphere of it, and I was never bored. Like, the worst thing you can commit in a horror film is to be bored, and I was never bored in this movie. But there wasn't really anything here that was new and fresh. It's not like there was anything in the storyline. I basically 20 minutes in kind of knew where it was going, and the last scene, which I thought was maybe the best scene in the movie, like the most action, the most tension at the last 7 minutes. There was nothing really surprising at the end there that I hadn't seen in older vampire films and other things. So I had a very strange reaction to this movie in that I was constantly like, oh, I like this. Oh, that not so much. Ooh, that's really good. Oh, no. You should see my notes. It's like back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. So I had kind of like a weird mixed kind of reaction to it. I think if I'd come into it with a really strong affection of the show, it might have been a different story, right? So you have that. I didn't have that coming into this. I was just looking at it as a 70s vampire horror film. Like what to expect. I didn't even know what the story was when I started watching it. So there wasn't anything about it that was really like surprising to me, and I like to be surprised, especially in a horror film. So that was something about it that I found lacking.
I think that's because they kind of played it safe.
Okay.
Because I really believe that the best ending for the show, for the film, would have been if Barnabas had made Maggie his Josette.
Okay.
And he had accomplished what he needed to accomplish, because he never received that in the television show. They were constantly finding some way of killing off Josette or killing off, his latest reincarnation of Josette.
Yeah.
And so I think that would have been a far superior ending. But the problem is that they made Barnabas so evil in the beginning, just like slaughtering these people, that it was just, they had to have a moral ending, and that would be killing the vampire. But I think that probably would have done it. One thing there's a couple things that really scare me about this film, that scared me when I was little, when I first watched it.
Okay, what was scary about this one, Jonathan?
So the stalking of Daphne, when she's on her way to get to the car. She parked her car so far away from the house. She parked it outside of the gate. I don't know if the gate was locked when she went to work or whatever it was, but that whole stalking of Daphne and how he's just going down the driveway, and then he opens the car door. You never think about that, because people didn't lock their cars in 1970 a lot of the time, especially in a small town, right?
Oh yeah.
And so they just didn't have their car doors locked. Nowadays it'd be unheard of to have your car unlocked. But so she had to, manly go over and try and lock that door so that Barnabas could not get in, but he just rips open the door and kills her.
Yeah.
So that was really frightening.
And that's like that's like minute 10, minute 15. It's very early, right?
Yes, it's very early in the film.
Yeah.
And then the staking of Carolyn was a really sort of a very big moment. And that's not giving anything away because they show that in the trailer. So I'm not giving spoilers.
Yeah, I'm trying to avoid spoilers of like the third act. Like I'm trying not to give away, because kind of the idea of this podcast is to maybe introduce some listeners to films that they might not have heard of, they might want to watch. And if we just talk about every scene all the way to the end, they might not watch it. So
that's true. So I will try to avoid that. But the staking of Carolyn was another thing, because that was just like, that was Hammer at its finest. That was Dan Curtis really taking the Hammer films and taking the best of the Hammer films and applying them here. Because, that's the thing about Hammer, is they stake their vampires very well. Dracula, Prince of Darkness. I mean, there's that staking scene where they take the female vampire and they just go boom, and then she's like, she's dead, and it's just like, so I think that was, really, really good work there. But that final act was so frightening to me. When Barnabas abducts Maggie after he takes her to St. Eustace Island, and Jeff has to go off to save her.
Okay.
And that whole series of events, from when Jeff arrives on the island, again, no spoilers, I just had to turn it off. I could not watch. Like, there was so much going on that never happened in the television show in this final act that it was just like very traumatizing. But I have to say that when they adapted it to the 1991 series, they built upon all of that, and they made it even more exciting and even more frightening. Okay. And there's this one scene in the 1991 series from NBC that really, really, still, when I watch it, it's still very frightening. And it's inspired by the last act of House of Dark Shadows.
Okay, cool.
Yes. So I think that there's a lot in this film that is pretty standard for a vampire film, which is why, you're watching this 50 years later and you're like, well, I've seen this all before, right?
Yeah.
But at the time, if you watched Hammer films and you got to know how Christopher Lee, Peter Cushing did all of that stuff, you're watching this, it would be very, very familiar, but also kind of new, which is that whole reincarnation aspect. Like, if you've seen, Bram Stoker's Dracula, the Coppola one, I mean, about this reincarnation, but that was not a thing before Dark Shadows. That was a Dark Shadows thing, which is why he ripped off Dark Shadows when he made that film. And then it just gets all of this praise and all of this other stuff. I'm like, guys, it was done before.
Well, I mean, I think just on a level of fear, I think the 1931 Dracula with Bela Lugosi is a more frightening film than House of Dark Shadows. Would you disagree with that?
I would say that.
And that came out 39 years earlier.
See, I was never scared of Bela Lugosi's Dracula.
Okay.
I love Bela Lugosi. Bela Lugosi's my favorite Dracula.
Okay, yeah.
Hands down, he's my favorite Dracula. And I think that the film, especially the first act in Transylvania, is a really remarkable feat. Because it was like one of the first talkie horror, the first talkie monster movie for sure.
Yeah, the first 20 minutes are amazing.
Oh yeah, it's absolutely amazing. Yes, and the thing about Dracula is that it's again one of my favorite movies, but it relies very much on the very creepy, disturbing atmosphere, which I love. Yeah, which I love.
Which there was a lot in House of Dark Shadows too, which I admired. Yeah.
But the reason that I found House of Dark Shadows so frightening as a child was because of the sheer level of violence. And I had watched, The Omen. I had watched, Hammer films. But it was just this level of violence and this sort of stalking terror that, they kind of brought to this film that was very frightening to me. And it's still these images are very much ingrained in my mind. So I think that they're both Dracula 1931 with Bela Lugosi and House of Dark Shadows are frightening in their own way. But like I would say House of Dark Shadows is far more frightening than any Hammer film that came before it.
Oh yeah, like
Um,
some of that kind of the Dracula Hammer films with Christopher Lee. Those are fun, but they're not
yeah,
really scary at all.
yeah,
You know?
yeah. So I did find House of Dark Shadows very frightening as a child, whereas there were very few other things that I found uh, frightening. There was never another movie that I watched that I had to stop.
Okay.
I never stopped watching a movie because nothing really scared me. But House of Dark Shadows did scare me because it was
Okay, but
building
what
that
about
tension in that
today?
last act.
What about today? Because when I was a kid, every horror film scared me. But like
Oh, well,
today,
see, it didn't.
is it scary to you today?
Nothing scary to me. Nothing was scary to me as a kid. That's what I'm saying.
Okay.
That there was nothing ever frightening to me
Okay, so this was like a
when I watched
rare.
movies. So
Okay.
this was rare that I actually had to stop something.
Yeah. Okay.
Like I could usually sit through it. Like I said, I watched The Omen. I
The
mean,
Omen is
Chucky.
very terrifying.
Well, The
Today for
Omen,
me.
The Omen is fright, but I didn't have to stop it.
Okay.
And I think it was because of the pacing of the final act of House of Dark Shadows. It was just
Yeah.
thing after thing after thing, which was the frightening thing. You know, The Omen, they give you a break because now all of a sudden there's this new person and there's this new thing coming to fruition, right?
Yeah.
And Damien's doing this new thing, but they give you some nice, relief in there. Whereas Dan Curtis is still like, nope, we're going to go this person, we're going to go this person, and we're going to go this person. And it's just boom, 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 boom in that last act. So I think that that's the thing that was successful in that final act of House of Dark Shadows was the fact that it just kept the tension and the fear going in these extremes like this, just these shocks and these surprises that you were just not prepared for, especially having come from the television show where everything was so different. But yeah, I would say that I think Dracula 1931 with Lugosi is an extremely effective film. It is he's my favorite Dracula, like bar none. And I love, and I think it gets a lot of unnecessary criticism from people. And people that say the Spanish version is superior, the one that was shot simultaneously, they don't know what they're talking about. They have no idea what they're talking about. I've watched Lugosi's Dracula in the theater, and I've watched the Spanish version in the theater.
Wow.
Nobody laughs.
Okay.
In the Lugosi version, no, there's not a single person laughing in the Lugosi version because it's so frightening, and the acting is so solid from Lugosi, from Dwight Frye, who plays Renfield, and from Edward Van Sloan, who plays Van Helsing. It's just so solid. Like those main three roles are, who cares about the rest of the cast? But those main three roles, just top notch, and like great acting throughout. Like you didn't even need to have any action as long as you had Lugosi and Dwight Frye in the whole thing. Like that makes a great movie.
All right, so back to House of Dark Shadows. So I wrote down a couple of things that I didn't like so much about the movie, more specific things, and you can kind of touch on them, and then I'll talk about the things I really liked. I did not like at the beginning how
I'm taking my cane out.
And you can hit me with the cane. You hit the screen. Okay. I did not like at the beginning how we have this moment of suspense in the first 2-3 minutes and the credits are going over. I didn't like that.
No, and that's MGM's fault.
Okay.
Because they say this film, there's like pages of this film.
Yeah. That was that'd be like at the beginning of Scream. If like the first 5 minutes of Scream, you have credits slowly. I'd be like, no.
That's because MGM said we're not going to have a horror film that's over 90 minutes. Like 90 minutes is the max. And so
so they had to rush.
They had to put the credits over. Yeah. To Dan Curtis's credit, though, he had more time to edit this film down than he did the sequel, Night of Dark Shadows. Darren Gross is this guy who's been working for years to get Warner Brothers to restore Night of Dark Shadows, because there's actual footage that we have found of Night of Dark Shadows, the sequel to this one. And he has been trying to get it, Warner Brothers to actually, go along with it. He's got the stuff. And while we have some of the actors still alive, get them to re-record some of the dialogue. They just haven't done it. So that's on you, Warner Brothers. That's your fault. But yeah,
you don't have to defend every criticism that I'm getting.
They made no. Oh no, but I do. I'm just going to give you some background. So MGM basically had this rule: a horror film cannot be longer than 90 minutes. And for House of Dark Shadows, it worked out fine. Like overall, it was very cohesive, worked very well. But Night of Dark Shadows had this much longer script, much more detailed story, and it suffered. Literally the night before, Dan Curtis just had to chop that movie up to get it down to 90 minutes. And it's because the studios were not going to, they want to run horror films in theaters. You got to remember this is a theater. And so they're booking, times.
Mhm.
And they want to have as many bookings as they can.
Mhm.
So that's why they wanted to have the 90 minutes. And so
Yeah.
that's why you see
Okay.
the
Yeah,
credits over it. But yeah, I
directors
don't
have to
like that either.
directors have to do that all the time, right? They
Yeah.
have, a 3-hour film and they're like, okay, it has to
Yep.
be no more than 2 hours. And it's like, okay,
Yeah.
I just got an hour from this. I thought the characters in dialogue say names way too much. Do you ever notice that? It's like every other line of dialogue, David, 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 Julia, 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 Julia. It's like the whole movie. They're always, every line of
I never
dialogue, they're
noticed
saying
that.
names.
No.
You've never
No, I never
I
noticed that.
never noticed that in a film. And I was like,
Huh.
Jesus. I think it was early in the film. I heard the name David about 20 times in the course of a minute. And I was
Interesting.
like, okay. So I started like kind of like listening for it, and it was a thing throughout the movie. So next
Maybe
time you
that's
watch it, listen
yeah.
for how
I'm
many
gonna look into that.
times, because you don't when you're talking to somebody, you don't say their name.
Well, Brian, what are you talking about?
I mean, it was just constant. Like it'd be like 3 sentences, and they would say the person's name.
I never
Anyway,
noticed that. That's
you've never
interesting.
noticed that? I mean, it wasn't in every scene,
Never
obviously,
noticed
but
it.
there were like 5 or 6
Huh.
scenes I noticed that a lot.
But you can't say you don't know who these people are.
I was like,
You
there
know,
was a
that's
scene. There was a scene. I was like, what is her name? And then just wait for it. Oh, there it is.
there. See, there you go.
So there you go.
Maybe as writers we need to implement that more often. Then nobody's ever going to be lost.
No, but it's got to be realistic. You don't say someone's name over and over when you're talking to them.
Brian, what are you talking about? So anyway, this is really good. Really good. That was cut from the film, which might be why they're saying the name so often in the beginning, because David had this really nice story arc. David. Yes, Brian, David. He had this really cool story arc in the beginning of the film that they put before a test audience, and they're like, no, cut that. That's terrible. It's where he pretended to hang himself in the closet.
Okay.
And this was all shot, and this was ready to go, and just kind of show what a holy terror this kid is, right? And why Maggie wants to leave, which is another big plot point that kind of got overlooked. But that was just this thing, and test audiences were like, no, you can't do that to a kid. That's traumatizing. That's horrifying. But that just shows you the difference between films today and films in 1970, where audiences were just horrified that a kid was gonna. But then you got Harold and Maude, but it was a similar concept, right? But it's just sort of bizarre to me that test audiences had this overtly negative reaction to this David hanging himself prank. And maybe today people would do the same thing, but 10 years ago, it wouldn't even have been an issue. But, society goes in this pendulum. So,
okay. Okay, a couple more things. I thought there was too much handheld. I liked the energy that some of it brought, but there were some moments, like there was a moment at the cemetery where the camera was just like kind of moving around the actors, where it looked very amateur, and I was like, okay, a little bit of handheld goes a long way. I thought Jonathan Frid was just okay. I did not find him to be as charismatic as like a Bela Lugosi. There was nothing about his performance that I was like, wow, this is a really unique vampire creation.
I would say that the film just does not give him the opportunity to build on the character like he did in the television show. But yeah, in that television show, he pretty much saved the show through his characterization of Barnabas Collins and making him this sympathetic character. Even though he's crazy and abducting people and like biting people, people just loved him. They felt sorry for him, and that was Jonathan Frid and Malcolm Marmerstein, that kind of and Ron Sprout too, I think, one of the writers, really just brought this aspect to the character. And that is sadly what is missing from House of Dark Shadows. You don't really get the remorsefulness and the sympathy that Barnabas evokes, because they originally wrote the character as just a Dracula, but Jonathan Frid pretty much reinvented him and made him sort of, and it was this one line of dialogue in the television series that he just delivered, and he's like, I remember this sunset from so long ago, something like that, in one of the very early episodes. And then the writers picked up on that. He's like, wow, this guy's really good at portraying this character as very sympathetic. And then they just went with that and they built on it. And that's how you have a good team of writers and actors. They kind of work well together to build off of each other's strengths. And that happened in the very early parts of Dark Shadows.
Okay.
And that is sadly missing from House of Dark Shadows, yeah.
And then I would say the last thing, I mean, besides some of the acting was a little stiff, and there was a character who, it seemed like every time he showed up, Elliot, I think, every time he showed up, he would give exposition. It's like, okay, like, oh, he's here to tell us, the audience, what's going on. I never really came to care about anybody in the movie, and that's
Yeah.
usually a sign of a movie that's not working as well as it could. I mean, just because it's a horror film doesn't mean
Yeah.
you can't, really relate or get involved with at least a couple of the characters. There wasn't like a really clear protagonist. It's a very much an ensemble cast of
Hmm.
characters. You never really spend a whole lot of time with any one person, so it was hard for me to kind of get involved with anybody. Whereas if this film had outside of maybe Barnabas, like a really clear protagonist who was maybe
Yeah.
going after him or something, it
But
didn't
yeah,
have that, so it was hard for me to care about what was happening.
there's not but that was the thing about Dark Shadows is Barnabas is the protagonist.
Yeah.
But here they were trying to make him the villain.
Yeah.
And I think that's one of the flaws because Barnabas is the hero. He's not the villain in Dark Shadows. And that's why it was so successful. And even though he does bad things, he's not a bad person. And so I think that was sort of one of the things that, in trying to take Dark Shadows 1,225 episodes of history of this really rich character and this really rich characterization.
So many episodes, oh my
God. By Jonathan Frid, just like this like historically significant character in the history of vampire lore of Barnabas Collins and just take him and put him in a film and have him maintain all of those attributes. You can't do it. And so I think that those criticisms are valid. I don't think that it's necessarily, the best horror film that's ever been made or necessarily the best vampire film that's ever been made. But I think as Dracula, it serves as a great adaptation of Dracula. And I think that if you start putting some of those Bram Stoker characters in place of the Dark Shadows characters, it might be a more enjoyable experience for you. And as somebody that likes the book Dracula, I think that works very well for me. But I agree that as an adaptation of Dark Shadows, it falls short. And I think that's some of the same things that you're seeing.
I've talked about this a little bit on the podcast before. I love 70s horror films. Early 70s, there's not very much. I have a Shudder, what that is, like the Netflix of horror kind of a thing, and they have they just premiered 2 other vampire films that came out around 1970, The Vampire Lovers and Countess Dracula. And in the week leading up to watching House of Dark Shadows, I took a look at those 2, and those 2 were very rough. So I'm like, House of Dark Shadows blew those 2 out of the water. It was much better film. But there was this weird period, like after 68, where you get 2 iconic horror films. You get Rosemary's Baby and Night of the Living Dead. 69, 70, 71, 72, there's very, very little in the horror genre, until The Exorcist comes along at Christmas 73. That's where then we get this like just boom, 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 nonstop lineup of great horror films for the rest of the decade. The early part of the 70s, I don't know what it is. There's just something kind of lacking in this period.
I think it's because I really do believe that The Exorcist changed everything.
Yeah.
Because Hammer ruled horror from, other than Hitchcock. Hammer ruled horror 50s other than Hitchcock and Creature from the Black Lagoon. Hammer ruled horror from 50s, 60s and into the 70s. And I think that, all those later Hammer films are just like very questionable, right?
Yeah.
So I think House of Dark Shadows is like the capstone piece. It's like the final, achievement in this age of horror film, which changed dramatically starting with The Exorcist. And I really believe that that's kind of where things went, that you have this period, Universal owns horror in the 1930s and the 1940s. And then Hammer owns horror in the 1950s and the 1960s. And then the 70s was this period of redefining horror and what was actually horrific. And I think it actually started with Rosemary's Baby in 1960. I think, Rosemary's Baby led to this whole religious thing that you're kind of seeing, like with the Exorcist and with
The Omen.
The Omen. Thank you. And then you've got a bunch of other people, trying to figure out, well, maybe that's not the only way that things can be horrifying. Maybe you can also have a slasher, and so then you got John Carpenter with Halloween. And so that, of course, Halloween launched Christmas, the next, and then Halloween really launched the next
10 plus years,
of horror. And so that's the thing about horror is it's very definable.
Yeah.
Like you can say, what is
Constantly
horror
evolving. Yeah.
in 1930? And you say, well, it's Bela Lugosi and it's Boris Karloff.
Mm-hmm.
What is horror in 1940? It's Lon Chaney. You know, what is
Mm-hmm.
horror in 1950, 1960? It's Christopher Lee. It's Peter Cushing.
Mm-hmm.
And then by the time you get to 1970, it's, well, what is horror? Well, I don't know. Like, because you've got Tobe Hooper, who is directing Texas Chainsaw Massacre, but also directing Salem's Lot. And so
two very different kinds of horror films.
Very different films. And Salem's Lot is the superior in my opinion. But that's just because I prefer that type of horror film. I prefer the
more atmospheric kind of
atmospheric.
Not the bloody, gory slasher.
I enjoy slashers to an extent. And Halloween is one of my favorite films ever. Like of all genres. Halloween is just like phenomenal. But it's not really a slasher film in terms of what would follow. You know, there's a lot of atmosphere in Halloween. Very little blood, and there's just so much atmosphere in Halloween. Whereas, you know, things that came later than that, it was just, you know, Friday the 13th. I don't know how you feel about Friday the 13th. I think
they're fun. They're not. It's not great cinema.
I think the character of Jason Voorhees is really iconic, but it's just really hard for me to sit through those movies. You know, whereas
they're all the same. You know.
Whereas I can sit through Halloween like over and over and over again.
Yeah.
And you know, I can sit through any monster movie over and over and over again. And so I think that's kind of that's just one of the cool things about horror is there's very specific periods and everybody has a particular taste.
Yeah.
And mine is gothic horror.
Okay, gothic horror. Yeah.
Really love gothic horror.
So so as you say, so in 1970, horror, where it's going hasn't quite been defined yet. So we have films like House of Dark Shadows, and you know, I've criticized it a little bit. There were also many things I really liked about it. I did like a lot of the camera work. I love the POV shot, the point of view shot of Barnabas arriving to the house. It was very Halloween, like him walking in and the lady like, "Hello, how may I help you?"
Before Halloween.
And this is 8 years before Halloween.
Yep.
4 years before they did it Black Christmas. Here's a 1970 horror film where it's like a character walking into this building, this castle mansion, in a point of view shot that lasted for a good minute, maybe longer. So I was like, oh, okay. This is before the iconic, you know.
I don't know if you noticed what they did with The Ring. I think it was excellent writing and directing, where they sort of introduced the character through the ring. You know, he's got the ring that's choking Daphne. He's got the ring coming out of the coffin choking Willie, and then the ring ringing the doorbell of Collinwood. And I think that was excellent directing and excellent writing choices, just to be that point of view, as you mentioned, but also focusing heavily on the ring and the cane, which is Barnabas Collins in a nutshell. So, and the point of view shot during the transformation scene with the Dick Smith makeup, I think was also an excellent choice. And I wish when he had transformed back that they would have done something similar.
The shot of him where it's out of focus and it slowly racks focus into his face, that is a great shot. Like that was like stellar horror cinematography. So I liked a lot of the camera work in it. I thought one of the creepiest scenes was the one of the boy throwing the ball and he comes across the vampire. That scene was really...
What was his name, Brian? Was
that David?
Yes. See? You remember.
I remember. Oh my gosh. Right. David. I was like,
I know,
no
that
more
was
David.
Very creepy. That was very disturbing. And you know, when you think about it, the implications of it are really horrifying because this scene is recreated in the 1991 show.
Okay. Is that who Jordan Joseph Levitt? Joseph Gordon-Levitt, is that who he plays? David?
Yes, he plays David. And it's recreated there. And so you got this kid that's so distressed about his family member dying that he's all alone and he's just in the state of depression and this disbelief that it actually happened. And he's like, you know, if I catch this one, Carolyn isn't dead. If I catch this one, Carolyn isn't dead. And then Carolyn isn't dead. It's really, really good writing. So I think that was phenomenal too.
Yeah, so I thought that worked really well. And then I kind of liked some of the scenes that you could kind of tell the low budget they could, like the scene where the police car crashes into the tree. It's very like kind of shaky, handheld. They probably didn't have the budget to actually show it. So
Yeah, no.
but I kind of like that. Reminded me of Night of the Living Dead a little bit. Like, you know, we don't have the money to show the crash, so we'll just kind of imply it. And I thought that worked okay.
Because MGM was on the verge of bankruptcy, while they were making this film. So they didn't have hardly any budget. Dan Curtis didn't have anything to work with, and they had to shoot it in less than 30 days, I believe.
Okay.
It was about a 30-day time period that they had to shoot this entire movie, which, coming off of, filming a 23-minute episode on television every day, it's cake, right?
Yeah.
But I mean, it's kind of, really unheard of for a major motion picture, from one of the big studios.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that, but yeah, they had budgetary constraints on this one too. So I think that was, reflected there. But cool.
And then I thought the best performance in the film was by Grayson Hall. Like, I just loved her look. I love her voice. I thought she brought something a little bit kind of different to that role.
Yeah.
It could have been a very just bland, pretty, younger actress, but she had a little bit more years on her, and kind of the way she spoke in the scenes, like kind of the way her character evolves throughout the movie. I wanted more of her. I thought she did a really good job.
Yeah, I think this is the sad thing about Grayson Hall.
Mm-hmm.
This is more trivia. So
more trivia. Oh my God.
More trivia. When they did the sequel, Night of Dark Shadows, Grayson Hall came back for that. Mm-hmm. And some bigwig at MGM didn't like her. So they had Dan Curtis cut all of her scenes, basically. And she plays this very Mrs. Danvers character in Night of Dark Shadows. She's very Mrs. Danvers, creepy housekeeper. And
wait, she's in the sequel?
Yes. Yes.
How? Oh, she's playing a different character.
She's playing a different character.
Okay.
Yeah, that's the thing about Dark Shadows.
Okay.
Dark Shadows is really an anthology series, because they go to different time periods, and all of the actors are still there, but they're playing different characters, and the same thing was reflected in the movies. And so Grayson Hall comes back for Night of Dark Shadows, and she plays this very creepy housekeeper, and some moron at MGM just says, no, we don't like her, cut all her scenes. And so Dan Curtis had to cut a lot of that, which would have been really fantastic cinema to be able to see more of her in that sort of role. But yeah, I think that as Julia Hoffman, she was very iconic. I don't think she had as much to play with in the film Julia as she does with the television series. But yeah, I'm glad you appreciated her.
Yeah, so she was great. And then I guess just the last thing, I thought, the kill scenes were really visceral and really well done. And, some of the blood looks kind of fake, but it's 1970, so that's okay. But, before 1968, you couldn't really show very much in film. And if you did, like, showing gore, you had to do black and white, like Psycho did in 1960. Like, oh, she gets, she's going to get stabbed in the shower. We have to make it black and white, or else this is not going to go, this is not going to pass the censors. So 1970... So yeah, exactly, which would have looked very weird in color. In 1970, 1971, you start seeing more kind of blood and gore on screen, and so this is one of the first horror films to take advantage of that. And so I thought the kill scenes were really well done. I thought the last scene, I don't want to give away what happens at the end, but I love the atmosphere of that last scene. I love kind of, it surprises you a couple times. It's not exactly what you expect to happen until the very end. And I thought like the kill scenes there, the attack scenes there were really well done. So yeah, and on that respect, I was like, this doesn't feel like a film that could have been made in 1957. Like, this feels like a movie that could only be made after 68. So I like that about it too.
Yeah, I think there's a lot to love about it. And I wish that it could have been longer, so you would have been able to get, more of the characters from the TV series, and more of their characters, and have a wider range. Like you said, some people like Thayer David, who's a phenomenal actor, he just kind of does a lot of like, this is what's going on, exposition, as you mentioned, whereas he has this fantastic range, like really fantastic range as an actor. And, I think that a lot of that, we didn't get to experience that in the film because of the way that, they had to tell this story in such a short period of time. So I think that the better representation of the actors comes from the television series and what they're capable of doing, just accomplishing in a single day, bringing 23 minutes of story to life. But I think that, and this was kind of rough on them. Joan Bennett has this famous quote, more trivia. She has this famous quote. She's out in the car, And she's in her limo, and these kids come up to her, and they're asking her for an autograph, and they're like, "Wait, are you Joan Bennett?" And she looks at them after a day of filming House of Dark Shadows, and she says, "I used to be." So so
Nice.
it's yeah, so it was really hectic, and it was just, there was a lot of things. Catherine Lee Scott, who plays Maggie Evans and Josette Dupre, she wrote this book, and I know that your podcast audience can't see it, but it's
Oh,
the Dark
cool.
Shadows movie book, and it has
Okay.
both scripts unedited except for the handwritten edits. So it's
Mhm.
kind of cool. It's an actual photocopy, and so she kind of details. She kept a diary of every day on the set, and if you want to know what a
Wow.
hectic movie making experiences, well,
Mhm.
it's House of Dark Shadows for you, because she's like, well, here we are, we're doing, because they didn't have, they had the kitchen, because they didn't build any sets really. The kitchen became Julia's lab. The kitchen in Lyndhurst became Julia's lab. And so she's describing all of the stuff, and then they're getting their hair done, like in some bedroom or something like that. So it was kind of a really cool experience. And the one thing she mentions constantly is it's very, very cold. Like the actors are literally freezing. So maybe if some of the actors appear stiff to you, it's because they are literally freezing.
Okay, nice. All right, good. So we have touched on, I mean, we've already talked about the acting, we've talked about the director. I always ask about theme. Is there anything like beyond just what's happening in the movie? Do you think there's anything, thematically going on in the movie that you think is interesting?
I think that the overall theme of love was very big,
Okay.
obviously,
Yeah.
in
Hmm.
in the 1960s, and I think that's kind of one of the reasons why the character of Barnabas Collins appealed to so many young people, in particular teenagers, uh, children, because Barnabas, unlike Dracula, is very much all about his love and his connection to his fiance,
Hmm.
who jumped from the cliff at Widow's Hill. And I think that the theme here is that love is timeless, and
Hmm.
love goes on. And I think the sad fact about it is that Barnabas had this one true love in his life, and he lost it, and now he's trying to constantly recreate it, and it just doesn't ever work out.
Hmm.
And I think that's kind of a really sad thing. So you find that person, and you don't lose them, right? That's kind
Hmm.
of a big thing. So I think that's one of the themes you can take away. I think another theme you can take away is, you know you can't necessarily change the nature of someone.
Oh, that's a good
So
one. Yeah, yeah. Hmm.
someone, if you're a vampire, you can't just necessarily take a drug and become something else. So I think trying to change somebody's nature, I think, is something that's not going to turn out well
Hmm.
for a lot of people. And so I think there's a couple of takeaways from Dark Shadows, House of Dark Shadows, but they all stem from the television series Dark Shadows itself.
Okay, nice.
uh, yeah, so I think there's a couple of themes and things you can take away from
Yeah,
it.
after this discussion, I'm really intrigued to visit to give the show a try. I mean, I'm not going to watch the
Yeah,
whole. I'm not going to watch the whole thing. That would take a while.
so
But I would love to
my
just
recommend
watch. I would I would love to know like what are the 2 or 3 episodes to find online, or what would
Well,
be a
you
good
can't just watch
representation.
2 or 3 episodes,
Two
Brian.
or
You
three,
you could
Jonathan.
you can't watch 2 or 3 episodes. I can give you 2 or 3 storylines.
Oh
Okay,
no,
so
I'm not
obviously
committing to a storyline.
the very first Barnabas Collins storyline,
Yeah.
where Jonathan Frid arrives as Barnabas Collins. There's a lot of writing by Malcolm Marmerstein. Uh, excellent, excellent work. I
Hmm.
would say that the haunting of Collinwood, where David Selby arrives as a ghost that's plaguing Collinwood,
Ooh, that sounds cool.
which is my favorite storyline, based on Turn of the Screw. Uh,
Oh,
Maggie
cool.
Evans Maggie Evans just becomes governess at
Hmm.
Collinwood during that point. That is really good, and they have these compilations, Brian. So you don't have to necessarily
Oh,
like.
okay.
So they do have compilations. I think the one is called
Like
The
a
Haunting
D
of
like a DVD
DVD.
set that just
Yeah,
has the episode. Okay, gotcha.
like what they did, MPI, which owns the rights to video distribution of Dark Shadows, they did what Dan Curtis was going to do with this film, and
Hmm.
they took episodes of the TV series and they put them together,
Okay.
and so they sort of streamlined it, and it does a lot of disservice to the actual show and to stuff like that, because I've never actually watched it, but I can't imagine it would be that good. So, but yeah, The Haunting of Collinwood with David Selby arriving is my favorite storyline.
Okay,
And then
I'll take a look at that one.
And then the 1897 flashback, where Barnabas goes back in time to save the Collins family from the ghost of Quentin Collins, who is hell-bent on destroying the Collins family, is by far my favorite storyline. But that is an entire year of the series, so I don't know if you're going to commit to that one, Brian. But you might. We might get you.
We'll see how things go. All right, so my last question about House of Dark Shadows, the film, you know, I'm asking all my guests, like, what is it like to look at a film that was released in 1970 through a 2020 lens? Is there anything about the film that dates it? How would it be made differently today? Like, if you took that same story and made it in 2020, how would it be different?
I don't think you could make House of Dark Shadows in 2020.
Okay.
Because you just don't have, if I'm being honest, you don't have the types of actors that you had back then. Because
that's a good point. Yeah.
Nearly everyone on Dark Shadows was a stage actor. They were a theater actor. Like Jonathan Frid is a classically trained Shakespearean actor.
Mm-hmm.
And so you got this very particular acting quality, which doesn't show as well in the film as it does in the TV series. But you got these really quality actors. And nowadays, I just look at a lot of actors, and it's almost, you know, a surprise to find one that isn't a cookie cutter, you know, that doesn't have, you know, just the basic, like, this is your Hollywood A-lister type actor. You know, It's kind of refreshing to find somebody that is as unique and has such a varied background as a lot of the actors on Dark Shadows.
Okay.
And so I think that it would be very difficult to, which is one of the things, because they're constantly trying to bring Dark Shadows back. You know, Tim Burton, you know, came up with Dark Shadows back in 2012, and everybody has their thoughts on that film. The best thing about it, I think, is the music by Danny Elfman, though I still prefer Bob Cobert's original Dark Shadows score, and I wish there were more of it in that score. But
the music was great in House of Dark Shadow. Yeah.
Dan Curtis used Robert Cobert, for every single film that he did, every single television series he did. So Robert Cobert, Josette's Music Box, I actually have it on the shelf. I have Josette's Music Box on the shelf behind me. I don't know if you can see it. But yes, that is my favorite theme from the whole series. And like I said, if you enjoyed that, I would definitely get the release of the 1991 Ben Cross series, the score for that, because that's Bob Cobert having a full orchestra, just going all out. So really phenomenal. But yeah, I think it would be very hard to find. And music is another thing that would be very difficult unless you're taking Robert Cobert's score and adapting it and bringing it into 2020. That would be extremely hard to do, because on the actual television show, one of the best characters was Bob Cobert's music. And in the film, I think one of the best things about it is Bob Cobert's music.
Okay.
And so I think that, you know, that you can take the Dracula story, you can take the Dark Shadow story, and you can, you know, do anything you want with it. But without that particular type of actor, and without a phenomenal composer that really understands how to build suspense and tension, and there are very few, because, you know, everything is just so guttural, like in film music today. It's just like, this is a sound of something clanking, and this is like, boo, something is shaking. But Bob Cobert actually understands how to build tension with music. And so I think that it would be very hard to recreate it. But, you know, if I want to think about, you know, a film that, you know, is similar, I would say that, you know, maybe The Woman in Black would be.
Yeah, I like that one a lot, with Daniel Radcliffe.
Yes, would be probably comparable in a lot of ways. And then I love The Conjuring, the core Conjuring films, you know, Conjuring 1, Conjuring 2.
Yeah,
and I think
Conjuring 2 is really scary.
Yes, and I think those films are comparable.
Yeah.
And so I think it can be done. And I think that Dark Shadows could work as a television series again.
Yeah.
I'm not so sure about a movie, but I think it would work very well, like on a streaming service or something like that. They actually wanted to bring it back. The CW or Warner Brothers, one of those people, wanted to bring it back, and they got somebody to write it last year before COVID and all that.
Okay.
And they want to create a direct sequel to the original series from 1966 to 1971. And I'm not in favor of that so much, because I think that really Dark Shadows is the story of Barnabas and Josette, and it is their love story, and that fact that he's constantly trying to find her. And, just having a sequel without any of those, main characters in the Collins family that we know from every single adaptation it's just kind of a mistake. And so I would love to see a proper Dark Shadows brought back to television or, a streaming service.
Oh, I bet it'll come back at some point. I think it's enough of a known property in the next 10 to 15 years. I bet we'll see something.
I like it, and I'd like it to be better than the Depp film.
Okay.
I'd like it to be truer to House of Dark Shadows than.
So that takes us to the first of our final two segments, which I'm calling the Divine Double Feature, where we pick a contemporary film that would make a really good double feature with our first film, which is House of Dark Shadows. The film that just made sense to me was Dark Shadows, starring Johnny Depp. Do you think that's a bad idea?
I think that's a terrible idea. I don't think they have anything in common.
Well, but the point of it, though.
I think Tim Burton's version of Dark Shadows.
I liked the new one.
I think Tim Burton's version of Dark Shadows is Tim Burton's childhood.
Okay.
I think that's what it is. I really think that as I'm watching that movie, I'm seeing less Dark Shadows and more like his childhood channeled through these characters.
But
same thing with Johnny Depp, because both of them were huge fans. Both of them were huge fans, and Michelle Pfeiffer, huge Dark Shadows fans. Like they love this show. They love this show, and so I think what ruined Dark Shadows, the new one, was Twilight, because this was in development, and they had a really super serious script. It was a super serious, true vampire love story.
It's goofy
that they had developed. And then Warner Brothers said, "Well, we can't do that because people are going to compare it to Twilight. So we have to take it in a different direction." And they brought in, the Abraham Lincoln vampire hunter guy to, go in and make it funny. And so I think that was the downfall of it, because Dark Shadows has an interesting sense of humor. It's a very unique sense of humor, but it's not outright like slapstick, like, stuff like that. And so that's where I think. So
it might not do the 1970 film justice, but I think it would be an interesting kind of to compare what horror cinema is like in the early 70s versus the early 2010s to kind of get a sense of how things have changed.
I would compare that to the double feature I would use would be The Woman in Black.
That's from the same year, 2012.
That's what I would use, because The Woman in Black is obviously a very serious horror film. It's not necessarily like The Conjuring, which is more, focused on possessions and things along those lines. But it's about, a haunted house, and it's about this character that sort of haunts these people, very much like Barnabas Collins haunts the Collins family. And
good, yeah.
So I would choose The Woman in Black because I think they're comparable in terms of tone. And in terms of execution, whereas the Tim Burton film
is much different in tone. But it shows you like two different periods of time in film history taking on the same kind of subject matter, and how two different directors, did something, kind of to their own unique aesthetic. I just thought that would be kind of an interesting comparison to make. Not to say that either one is better than the other.
I would compare House of Dark Shadows, if you wanted to see the same storyline, to the 1991
series. Which I have not seen, and I'll definitely check that out too. Yeah, The Woman in Black is a much
script is very much the same.
The Woman in Black, I think, is a much better film than House of Dark Shadows. So I would, I would like, if you were to watch Woman in Black second, you will have a much better, scarier time, I think, in that one. I was thinking vampire films, and I was looking, and I was like, oh yeah, there was the Tim Burton Johnny Depp, and that might be an interesting comparison. But our listeners can do what they like. You can go with Jonathan's advice, or you can go with my advice.
But I will say this, Brian, you're going to get a lot of hate mail from the Dark Shadows fans, because it's the most divisive thing that's ever happened in Dark Shadows was the
2012 adaptation. Okay.
Yeah. Because there's so many people that just absolutely find it appalling. I don't particularly care for it. I think there's some good things in it, and I think there's some good acting in it.
Yeah.
but I as an adaptation of Dark Shadows, I think it fails.
Okay.
Whereas House of Dark Shadows, as adapting Dark Shadows, is not the best adaptation of Dark Shadows, but it's a pretty solid adaptation. And I think it gives more respect to the source material than the Tim Burton film.
You just said Dark Shadows a lot. It reminded me of David.
Yes, Brian.
David.
Yeah,
I'm glad,
Brian. I'm glad that you pointed that out, Brian.
All right. No, that's a great idea. I love Woman in Black. I haven't seen it in a while. Really creepy. I remember 2 or 3 scenes really freaked me out when I saw that in the theater. So yeah, that's a great choice for a second film. And then our final segment, Beyond the Flick, talking about the vampire movie genre. Obviously, I pick an actor or director or genre affiliated with the film, and we pick our 2 or 3 favorites. I thought for House of Dark Shadows, a really good one to talk about would be the vampire movie genre. So, we've already talked about some other vampire films, but if you had to pick 2 or 3, like, what are your favorites? It's a big question, I know.
It is a big question because vampires are my favorite and Dracula is my favorite and Barnabas Collins is my favorite. I think that my favorite Dracula is Bela Lugosi.
Okay.
Bela Lugosi is actually
the film or the actor you're talking
the
about?
actor.
The actor, your favorite Dracula actor. Okay.
My favorite Dracula is Bela Lugosi.
Okay.
There he is for your video audience. And so Bela Lugosi is the best Dracula, hands down. As and it's unfortunate that Universal didn't allow him to play Dracula more than in 1931 and then in Abbott and Costello Meet Frankenstein.
Great movie, Abbott and Costello Meet Frankenstein, 1948, much later.
One of my it is probably
that's number one.
If I had to pick a favorite movie, it's definitely in the top 3. It's along with
wow. Okay.
It's along with Salem's Lot.
Yep.
And The Wolfman and Son of Frankenstein.
Okay.
But I think Abbott and Costello Meet Frankenstein is a fantastic Dracula movie.
Oh yeah.
It's not really about, because who is Frankenstein in Abbott and Costello Meets Frankenstein? It's really Dracula. Dracula becomes Dr. Frankenstein. He's the guy that wants to bring the monster back to life. So I think the more apt title would have been Abbott and Costello Meet Dracula. Yeah. But that was a Universal trying to get back at Lugosi, like they were constantly doing throughout his entire career. Just trying to really, whatever. But Lugosi's the star of that, along with Abbott and Costello. So I love Abbott and Costello Meet Frankenstein. Bela Lugosi is my favorite actor to have ever played Dracula, and I don't think anyone will ever be able to compare to Bela Lugosi, who truly was Dracula. I mean, for all intents and purposes, you can call him Bela Lugosi, but he was Dracula. And Bram Stoker, wrote the character as one thing, but Lugosi redefined the character. And you don't ever think of Bram Stoker's original characterization of Dracula. When you think of Dracula, you think of Bela Lugosi. You don't think of anything that Stoker wrote.
He's what we think of when we think the look, the voice. We think Bela Lugosi for almost everybody, right?
Yes, 100%. So I would say that Bela Lugosi is my favorite Dracula. Like I said, I do not have a favorite Dracula movie because they all have good things about them, and they all have questionable things about them.
Dracula 2000. You see that one? Dracula 2000. Not one of the better ones.
I do not acknowledge Dracula films really beyond the Frank Langella one.
Okay. So anything in the last 20 years is like, nope.
Like even 40 years. Just like beyond that.
Okay.
Van Helsing could have been a good movie, but
the CG ruined that one. Yeah. So what like 2 or 3, like just the film titles, what would you go with?
Okay. So vampire films?
Vampire films.
Salem's Lot is my favorite vampire film. Not the whatever remake was that they came out in 2000, whatever, but the original one with all of those.
Now, is that technically a film? Because wasn't it a miniseries television?
Well, it was a television film, but it had a theatrical release.
Oh, it got a theatrical release. Okay, there you go.
It did.
Cool.
It received a theatrical release afterwards. It's a shorter film, so you if you're going to watch it, you make sure you watch the full television production. But yeah, Salem's Lot is the best vampire film.
It's great. Super creepy. Stephen King adaptation. I've heard talk that they're thinking of doing a Salem's Lot again.
Yes,
a theatrical.
I heard that as well.
A theatrical film, because Stephen King is still bigger than ever with it and all of these other.
And I hope that they keep Barlow to the 70s Barlow, and not make him like he is in the book, where he kind of has dialogue. He's just much scarier as this Nosferatu like vampire that's just so visceral and just frightening. That film, Salem's Lot.
Yeah.
That is one film. I don't get like the heebie-jeebies.
The boy in the window is creepy.
Yes. Salem's Lot is probably the scariest film. Now that I think about it, to answer your earlier question, Salem's Lot is probably the scariest film that I still watch, and it's still scary. And what is the most frightening thing in Salem's Lot is when that poor man ends up in the teacher's house, and he's a vampire now, and he's sitting in that rocking chair, and he goes, "Teacher."
Yeah.
Teacher, with those yellow eyes. Whoever was in charge of the makeup in Salem's Lot, best thing to happen to vampires since Barnabas Collins. Like, hands down. Like, and then after that, they just sort of like went and did their thing again, and we haven't had a really good, solid vampire movie since then, I don't think. So yeah, Salem's Lot is my favorite traditional vampire film, but Abbott and Costello Meet Frankenstein is my favorite Dracula film.
Okay, yeah, I was just gonna say you're gonna be mad at me because all my three favorites came out after Salem's Lot.
Oh, really? Tell me about those.
Okay, so just real quick, so Salem's Lot and what are the other two for you?
Oh, Abbott and Costello Meet
Frankenstein. Okay.
Abbott and Costello Meet Frankenstein, and I like House of Dark Shadows.
House of Dark Shadows. Okay.
Too. Yeah.
All right.
Yeah.
So I've got some more. So I have like a long list of like honorable mentions, right? The original Nosferatu from 1922 is a really creepy film. It's hard to, silent film I struggle with a little bit, like from beginning to end, but there are scenes in that movie that are great.
Yes, very iconic.
The 1931 Dracula. I really like Dracula's Daughter, the 1936.
Oh my goodness! Yes, really, we should do a whole podcast on that.
Like an early kind of queer horror
Dracula's
film. Daughter. Gloria Holden.
Yes.
Really great, kind of unusual sequel. And then
it's a phenomenal film. Very underrated.
And then some more recent films I like. I like Fright Night, Near Dark, Blade 2, the second one, I think is a really solid action vampire film. And then my favorite television series of all time is Buffy the Vampire Slayer.
Oh, cool.
That's been I've watched that series 3 times through. I love it like intensely. I'd probably do a whole podcast about it if there weren't like 5-6 other people who've already done that. So I love that show. It's meant a lot to me ever since I saw it in college. But here are my 3 favorite vampire films. The Lost Boys.
Okay, yeah.
Which solid is really fun. Joel Schumacher, great cast. Kiefer Sutherland is amazing in that film as one of the vampires. From Dusk Till Dawn. With George Clooney and Quentin Tarantino, kind of an unusual film in that the first half of it is like Pulp Fiction, and then the second half it turns into this murder mayhem vampire movie. Tom Savini, great stuff. And then my favorite vampire film. Did you see Let Me In?
I
absolutely adore that movie. I've seen it like 5 times. I think it's great.
Going to, but then I saw The Babadook. Or however you pronounce it.
That's a good one too. Yeah.
I hate it.
The Babadook. Oh, you don't like The Babadook?
I hate it. No.
Oh, I've shown that to some students, and they were terrified. It was a lot of fun.
Because they said it's similar to that, so I said I'm not going to watch it.
Oh, it's not like The Babadook.
Oh well, that's what I heard. So
there's a little bit, maybe like tonally kind of similar.
I thought
not the same
problem.
Story.
I thought that but I thought that the Babadook was a little. Into itself,
like thought of itself is very self-important.
Yeah, That's the feeling I got from watching it.
Okay.
And I don't, maybe it was the mood I was in at the time. I don't know. Maybe I'll give it a second viewing and see if I change my mind. But
so Let Me In is a remake of a foreign film called Let the Right One In, which I believe came out in 2006. I saw the first film later, so it was kind of like if I had seen that film first, maybe the 2010 American version wouldn't have had as much impact on me. The first one I saw of the two was Let Me In 2010. But it's like if you like vampire movies, Jonathan, it's worth a look. It's really it's a quieter film. It's not especially scary. It's one of those films that really get you involved in the characters, and the main character is a young boy who befriends this girl in his apartment complex, and she turns out to be a vampire. And it's like the mood of it, the atmosphere. It's directed by Matt Reeves, who would go on. He did Cloverfield, and he went on to do two of the Planet of the Apes films, the newer ones, and he's just got a great eye for filmmaking and the framing of his. There's a scene of a car rolling down a hill that's like one of the most intense, amazing, like kind of action scenes I've ever seen especially in like a quieter horror film. It's just one of those that it's like it's creepy, the dread. It's everything's kind of like internal, and then there'll just be these little bursts of violence that just kind of freak you out, all the way to the last scene set in a pool that is unbelievable. Like just
cool.
absolutely unbelievable.
Interesting.
So it's worth a look if you like vampire.
I will look at it. I will look into it. I'm a very classics type guy.
Yeah.
Like I love the classics. So if anytime I can find a film, which is why I appreciate The Woman in Black, and which is why I appreciate The Conjuring so much, is because they harken back to those earlier gothic horror films. And so that's really what I'm into. So when I say, I don't necessarily appreciate anything, after Salem's Lot, it's because that the tone and the mood has changed significantly from what I grew up with and what I enjoy watching. So I think that there's probably a lot of great vampire films that have been made in the past 30 years or so, but it's just not my personal preference, but other people may like them, and so I'll check that one out for sure.
Okay. Awesome. Cool. Well, that takes us to kind of the end here, Jonathan. Is there any final words, anything you want to promote, or where our listeners can find you? Anything you want to tell us here at the end?
Hopefully back here one day to talk about more films.
Yes,
if
absolutely.
You'll have me. If you don't mind me chiming in and constantly giving you tidbits and
I would love to. I would love to do another episode with you where we looked at a horror film of the early 70s that neither one of us has seen. I think that would be kind of an interesting conversation, right?
Yes,
because you brought a lot. You brought a lot of background knowledge to House of Dark Shadows, having seen the show, and it meant a lot to you.
That would be really cool. Yeah.
Like, what if we did one where we both just went in totally blind? We didn't know what it was about. We didn't bring anything into it. That'd be an interesting conversation just to talk about 70s horror, and it'd be a lot of fun.
That would be awesome.
All right. Well, cool.
Excellent.
Thank you, Jonathan, for being here. This has been a lot of fun, and thank all of you for joining us at Film at 50. Please give the podcast a 5-star rating and a review, and tell your friends and family about us. You can find Film at 50 online at filmat50.com, Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. And you can email us at 50yearsagoinfilm@gmail.com. Also, take a look at the Patreon page, which has exclusive bonus content, at least 2 new episodes every month. Bonus stuff that's really fun. So you can check that out. Thanks again, everybody. And until next time, remember, 50 never looked this good.